chance to talk about either the Gospel of Germs or the Pickpocket's Tale, so we have some catching up to do on Friday. Today I want to talk about a weird mix of things. That is the Panic of 1893, the American Railway Union, and the other roots of progressivism. We talked before about progressivism and where it comes from. Is it the old middle class, the new middle class, or this sort of upper class? And there are a bunch of positions on this. I want to argue, though, that we are missing the role of workers in this, and unions in particular, in some part of the progressive movement. But it's a complicated way that these labor unions play in the 1890s in creating what we would call progressivism. So I want to sort of lay that out a little bit. Remember last week, we were talking about the so-called $1 billion Congress, right? And the $1 billion Congress is this Congress that's composed mostly of Republicans, that in 1890 they control the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and they create the Reed Rules, which streamlines all this legislation, including creating a whole bunch of new territories that are going to be Republican strongholds, and passing a tariff. And a lot of people have talked about the tariff in the context of gold and silver, and that's not unimportant, but I think the crucial thing to understand is the role of sugar in all of this, because sugar is by far the single biggest source of revenue. It's $50 million a year into the United States budget that comes from sugar. The reaction against the actions of this $1 billion Congress lead to a pretty drastic shift in congressional representation. And so we see in 1892, in response to the $1 billion Congress, that Democrats take over this kind of sweep through much of the regions in the North that they had previously not swept into. The trouble for the Democrats is that they sweep this election. They come to power in 1892 in the House, and they inherit basically a massive financial problem, which is baked into this tariff law, which basically says that tariffs are going to increase, but they don't actually provide very much revenue. And there's no tariff on raw sugar. And this is going to basically suck all the money out of the Treasury, so that the U.S. Treasury has a surplus of $100 billion in 1889, and by 1893, when Cleveland actually takes office, the Democrats are in power, but they're in power in a situation in which the federal government has no money in the Treasury, and there's a run on the stock market, first a run on the dollar and then a run on the stock market. And this is not like the other panic that we talked about, 73, which is an international panic. This is really just an American panic. It really just hits the United States. There are some effects in Britain and elsewhere, but it's much, much stronger felt in 1893. Now I want to talk a little bit about the sugar, because the sugar matters a lot for understanding what happened, some other things that happen. Okay, so sugar manufacturing. A little bit about sugar manufacturing. National debt at this time is the national, let's see, the U.S. doesn't have a debt before 1890. It has actually a surplus before 1890. By 1892, the U.S. is in debt for the first time since, the 80s. So the U.S. budget surplus in the period earlier was really embarrassing to Republicans, because why do they have these high tariffs on goods coming into the United States if the U.S. is running a budget surplus? Yeah, I'm not sure how they thought the shortfall would be made up. I think they thought by doubling the tariff rate on everything else that more money would come in. But if you know anything about pricing, we talked a little bit about neoclassical economics before. If you double a tariff on something, then fewer things are likely to come in. As a result, you're going to lose money. So the tariff on steel and the tariff on tin and copper and all these other sorts of things that are raw materials that come in just can't make up the budget shortfall. The real reason for the sugar tariff, though, is because of the power of this man, Henry Havemeyer. Henry Havemeyer is the head of what's called the Sugar Trust, and he is basically controls almost all the sugar refineries in the United States, with the exception of one in California. And it's they import raw sugar mostly from Cuba, and they export. They produce cube sugar, white sugar. The sort of domino sugar packets that you've seen before, those actually, this becomes the domino factory, but also that sugar that's used in a manufacturing process. Now, why would Havemeyer want to eliminate a tariff on raw sugar? Remember that raw sugar, the processed sugar is used by canners and packers in this period. There's an insane amount of sugar that's being consumed. The Green Bay Packers actually get their name from the packing industry in Green Bay, Wisconsin, which is basically meat packing. So how does Havemeyer do it, first of all? Havemeyer does it because of his control of this man, Nelson Aldrich, who is the head of the Senate Finance Committee, and he ensures that there will be no tariff on raw sugar. The reason for no tariff on raw sugar is this. Klaus Spreckels, who is the head of a California refinery. And Klaus Spreckels has a very, I'm going to move this up because it's not visible. There we are, Klaus Spreckels. Born in 1828 and dies in 1908, and this is his California refinery in San Francisco. And it's the competitor to Havemeyer. Spreckels refuses to join the Sugar Trust, and Spreckels has a sort of secret that allows, not a secret, but a special inside track that allows him to compete with the other folks in the sugar industry. His secret is a relationship, a very close relationship with the King of Hawaii. Spreckels is friends with the King of Hawaii. Hawaii is at this point ruled by Hawaiians, more or less. And the King of Hawaii has a good relationship with him. And Spreckels negotiated in 1874 a tariff that basically gave Hawaii a most favored nation status with the United States. So at this point, Hawaii is independent. And it's got a most favored nations status. So while there is a tariff on raw sugar coming in, there's not a tariff for raw sugar coming from Hawaii. And that means that Spreckels, before 1890, from 1874 to 1890, everyone else is paying a tariff on their raw sugar, including Havemeyer. This is, as he sees it, as a way of protecting his trust. Spreckels, though, because of the most favored nation status, has a special deal between the U.S. and Hawaii. He doesn't have to pay that tariff for raw sugar. So he's shipping this sugar from Hawaii, which is in the middle of the Pacific, all the way to California, to his refinery there. And the inflated prices for Cuban sugar are so high that Spreckels can make quite a bit of money by exporting or producing sugar, which can then be sold in California. The reason then that it's in 1889 rather, that Spreckels, who basically controlled California sugar, threatens to go to the Midwest. And with that, the Sugar Trust moves in. The Sugar Trust gets on the McKinley tariff an elimination of the tariff on sugar. Now, why eliminate the tariff on raw sugar? The reason for that is because Cuba is very close to New York, relatively speaking, and if there's no tariff on raw sugar, then the advantage that Spreckels gets goes away if no one has a tariff. Does that make sense? So if there's no tariff on raw sugar, then the Spreckles advantage of shipping from Hawaii to California goes away because everyone's paying no tariff. And let's think about it. We've got there's a tariff of, I don't know, say 30 cents a ton on, no, $1 a ton on sugar coming from anywhere, raw sugar coming from anywhere. Spreckles doesn't pay that $1 a ton because of the most favored nation status. Everyone else does pay that tariff, and it feeds the federal government. The federal government eliminates that sugar tariff. The federal government is getting no money. Everybody who's in the sugar trust, who's pulling in their sugar from Cuba, now no longer has to pay for that raw sugar. Spreckles, though, is no longer has a price advantage coming from Hawaii. Hawaii is a very long ways away, and Spreckles is suddenly in trouble. So that's the reason that sugar is taken off. Okay, a little bit of background about Hawaii. In 1819, U.S. missionaries arrived from New England in the brig Thaddeus in Hawaii, and they tried to clean up the grog shops and brothels that had emerged in Hawaii. Hawaii had become a place for sailors who had deserted from their ships earlier, American sailors mostly, who had deserted, and they were called beachcombers, these people. And other ships would drop off troublemakers, and so there was this that kind of vast number of native Hawaiians, and then these sort of troublemakers in Hawaii. Exactly. 90% McKinley tariff was 1890, so no sugar tariff after 1890, or no raw sugar tariff after 1890, and but high tariffs on everything else. Hiram Bingham called Hawaii a place filled with unrighteous, fornication, wickedness, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without natural affection, implacable and unmerciful. Hiram Bingham was not so good on parallelism. He's got nouns and adjectives there. But in any event, a lot of these merchants, these missionaries, arrive in 1819 to try to clean the place up. The beachcombers arrive in Hawaii starting from the 1760s forward. They may have actually preceded that. Some of them are British. This is where Herman Melville actually spent time. Herman Melville's first book was about Hawaii in the, when is that? 1820s and 30s, just as these new reformers start to arrive. And there are lots and lots of these beachcombers who've been there for decades, and they're native Hawaiians. They're descendants of native Hawaiians, but they're not Polynesian. They're mostly American. Okay, so that's Hawaii. Once the reformers come in 1819, they try to reform the place. This is men dancing hula, the hula dance. Hula dance was actually not a woman's dance; it was a man's dance. It was used for storytelling in the earlier period. It's the impact of the beachcombers, though, that persuade women to wear grass skirts, and there's a lot of prostitution and things like that on the island. When the reformers arrive after 1819, they create the thing called the Mumu, M-U-U-M-U-U, also called the Mother Hubbard outfit, which is designed to protect the modesty of Hawaiian women. So Hawaii is a funny place. It's got a king, it's got a lot of native Hawaiian people, and a small number of people who are foreigners called haoles. Some of them are these sort of do-gooder folks who arrive who want to end prostitution, and others who are kind of profiting on prostitution in the island. So these haoles, non-indigenous entrepreneurs, emerge. They're children of the New England missionaries, and they build sugar plantations in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s. At this point, by the 60s and 70s, Hawaii is importing not just importing workers from China and Japan. Japan is at this point relatively poor, and so there are Japanese folks who are coming as indentured servants to work on these plantations. So in 1874 and 75, the Hawaii was exempted from the sugar tariff. Hawaii then becomes effectively a protected market for producing sugar, and there's an explosion of sugar plantations in this region. Spreckels has a raw sugar mill called Sprecklesville in Hawaii that is basically his own town, and it gives him this sort of price advantage. All right. So, sorry, this is very complicated. So the McKinley tariff removes the tariff on raw sugar, creates great competition from Cuba, and what the Howleys do is another thing that happens in the McKinley tariff is that there's a subsidy for producing sugar at home. A subsidy of 2 cents per pound, which is actually quite high subsidy for producing sugar at home. Louisiana is trying to start up a sugar industry. It's just really not close enough to the equator for Louisiana to productively produce sugar, but it tries to anyways. There's a 2 cent per pound subsidy for sugar. There's also a subsidy for people to grow sugar beets in Illinois. So there's an attempt to sort of create an American sugar market. So what the Howleys think in 1893, of 1890, after this McKinley tariff passes, is the only way that we're going to be able to productively produce sugar and sell it in the United States is to have a revolution and make Hawaii a state. And if we make Hawaii a state, then we get the 2 cent per pound subsidy. And then we're golden again. Because the 1890s McKinley tariff made it impossible to grow sugar and sell it in the United States because it's so far away. So as a result, they decide to overthrow the queen. By 1891, the king had stepped down, replaced by the queen, his daughter, Liliuokalani, and she is not especially happy with the Howleys, and so they push back heavily against the queen. The Howleys decide to overthrow her in January of 1893, and they declare a provisional Republican government that will seek annexation to the United States. The only reason they seek annexation, they had things pretty sweet before, is because of the McKinley sugar tariff. Because now they no longer have this advantage for producing raw sugar to sell it to the United States, and the only way they're going to get it is if they get this sugar subsidy and become a protectorate. So the U.S. Minister to Hawaii, John L. Stevens, provides help to the Howleys when this revolt starts, and he orders the landing of 150 Marines near the palace. And the Republican president Harrison repudiates this agreement. He's still president in 92, going into 93, but he waits for Grover Cleveland to act. And Cleveland, the Democrat, says this is ridiculous, and he orders the new officials to restore the queen. They refuse, and because it's so far away, there's nothing they can do, and effectively Hawaii becomes a protectorate. Okay, so the McKinley sugar tariff not only, the McKinley Act, the McKinley tariff not only causes the draining of the Treasury, which causes a financial panic, it also leads to a revolution in Hawaii. And it's how Hawaii becomes a state in the period that we're talking about. All right, now I want to talk about the 1893 panic a little bit. And to do that, I need to shift gears yet again. Distance was a major factor. Yeah, it was. The distance away from, it just made it very difficult for McKinley to force people to do this. He's not thrilled with the idea of a... He's not thrilled with the idea of a protectorate, but there's not a whole lot that he can do because people on the ground support him, including the at this point the person who's what was his name? Sorry, John L. Stevenson, who is the minister to Hawaii, he basically supports them. He supports a protectorate, and the distance is a big issue. There are people who believe that Hawaii ought to become a state. There are people who believe that Hawaii would be a kind of gateway to California, to the Chinese market. If you think about it, Hawaii is in a strange place for being a part of the United States. It's right in the middle of the Pacific, but it would be an excellent coaling station. And Pearl Harbor is actually slightly before this, is declared a separate region and this is really in some ways maybe the beginning of U.S. imperialism. It kind of depends on what you mean by imperialism, though, because eventually Hawaii is going to become a protectorate, and then it's going to become a state. Some of the other things that the U.S. acquires after Hawaii, they're never going to become states. So places like Puerto Rico and others, Guam, that are going to be acquired by the United States are never going to have state representation. But Hawaii ultimately is going to become a state. Well, much, much later, around 1960 or something like that, it's going to become a state. But it is a kind of imperial venture, and it's largely these haoles that are at the center of that. Okay, now I want to shift gears and talk about Eugene Debs. So apologize for this. Dollar imperialism. Dollar imperialism is more used to describe the relationship within the U.S. Kind of pushing other folks to get onto the U.S. dollar, and that would be places like Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, and other places like that. Ordinarily, when we talk about dollar imperialism, we're talking about that. Gunboat democracy is not directly about the dollar, but it's largely about loans that are then you send Marines in to sort of enforce those loans. And I'm covering up Eugene Debs, 1855 to 1926. He edits the Locomotive Fireman's magazine. All right. He's going to become very important for understanding the resolution to the 1893 Depression and how people interpret it. So let me talk a little bit. Yes, he ran for office from jail. So he was born in the hog-killing town of Terre Haute, Indiana. His father was an Alsatian intellectual, and he named him after the renegade French novelists Eugene V and Victor Hugo. And as a renegade himself, he dropped out of school in 1870 at age 14 to work in railway shops. He was first a sign painter, but he soon became a locomotive fireman, but just for a very short time. When the Panic of 1873 struck Terre Haute, he had traveled west, finding work briefly as a fireman in St. Louis. After that, by 1874, he's lost his job. He returns home to office work at a wholesale grocery house. Though his career had ended as a locomotive fireman lasted for about 6 months, he sought to join the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and pay dues as an affiliated member, even though he wasn't any longer a fireman. Now, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen was a secret fraternal organization and life insurance society that rarely took on unaffiliated members. But Debs drew close to the Terre Haute organizer, and he became the local secretary of the order, and then rose through its ranks as the editor of its monthly magazine. So one way to think about Debs, a really important thing about Debs, is that magazine, because the magazine is very important. Right? The magazine is very important because that's how Debs becomes basically a master organizer. Debs regretted never having finished high school. He dropped out at 14. He started working at that age, and he became a lifelong autodidact, somebody who teaches himself not just to read and write, but everything. For years, he taught himself literature and science through private reading. As he continued to work in the Terre Haute grocery warehouse, he took business courses at night. And these principles of edification and self-improvement initially attracted him to the Locomotive Fireman's magazine. By the 1880, Debs turned the magazine into a social networking and organizing tool that proved vital to the growth of the order. So distributing the magazine was sort of uniquely easy for firemen, because firemen could travel over very long distances. They had free travel on any railway cars if they were a fireman. And it was possible for tramp firemen to earn a small commission from the union by selling subscriptions to other firemen by traveling, and thus geographically expanding the membership base, right? So a fireman gets free travel on the railroad, on any railroad, and as a result, he can recruit union members. A fireman promoted to engineer moved from the left side of the train to the right side of the train, and having crossed to the other side, an engineer was usually eligible to leave the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and join the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers. But the engineers were less active and smaller, and if an engineer continued to pay his locomotive fireman dues, he remained in good standing as a fireman and thus entitled to the death benefits and the right to vote. Okay, so this is why lots and lots of engineers remain with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, even though they're no longer firemen. It becomes something like an industrial union. Debs drastically changed what was inside the magazine under the traveling fireman's arm. Beginning in 1880, his magazine grandly promised to explain the fundamentals of science and civilization to firemen. The first issue explained the relationship between mathematics, algebra, calculus, and chemistry. That's true. Yes, it's true. There were, in fact, I'll talk a little bit about that. But yeah, there's massive. There ultimately is massive defection and tension between the firemen and the engineers on this issue. But what happens is the Fireman's Magazine becomes this sort of, for most workers who are firemen or engineers who never went to college, this becomes a kind of makeup for college. It promised the union, the first issue explained the relationship between mathematics, algebra, calculus, and chemistry. It promised that the union, oh, right, that's right, that's why they're called firemen, is they're actually making fire. They're putting the fire into the furnace. The first issue is explain the relationship, sorry, I keep saying that. It promised that the union promoted the slow and steady march of civilization. Just as coral was built over millions of decades by dying water bugs, according to Debs, and pyramids rose from a labor of hundreds of years, so the common brotherhood of men that the union promoted would slowly bring civilization toward a cooperative moral order. So he argued that both coral reefs and pyramids represented the collective labor of tens of thousands, water bugs and people, but whatever. And that this civilization was the thing that the Locomotive Fireman's Magazine emphasized. Now, death was discussed on every page of the Locomotive Fireman's Magazine, just like the dead water bugs and the pyramids suggest. The connection between death and the railroad brotherhoods in the late 19th and early 20th century is important, and it's a little bit strange. The order's foremost calling, after all, was to provide death benefits to widows and children of members, and perhaps the single most dangerous profession of the 19th century. The first issue in Debs's Locomotive Fireman's Magazine described the plight of a widow who believed her husband's claim that he was a paid-up member, only to discover in a tragic accident that killed him the next day. But by not paying his dues, the widow and child received nothing but a one-time charity payment from a few friends who remembered him. So the Locomotive Fireman's Magazine kind of promoted the insurance that was delivered by the locomotive fireman itself. But that by becoming a member, you were also getting death insurance. Aaron Rosenthal, is a historian of labor history, has called the railroad brotherhoods a death cult. And in many ways, it captures the vocabulary of the brotherhood publications like the Locomotive Fireman. There's a quote that Rosenthal gives which says, "The death always spoke in the ear of the railway worker. The squeaking wheels never ceased their music, the wheels that also carried future victims." And so the sort of danger and death that was associated with the work become kind of baked into how the locomotive firemen talked about and so this was at a time when life insurance was relatively expensive, and basically unions provided that death benefit. Not all unions, but especially the railroad brotherhoods. So it was a peculiar combination in Debs's magazine, the regular discussion of the death of workers and its ambition to instruct workers in physical chemistry, botany, classical rhetoric, and the history of religions. Debs, the self-taught learner, became Debs, the instructor in scientific universals. The older Brotherhood magazines just cribbed from scientific magazines of the day, but none had the audacity to blend the familiar stories of Union meetings with descriptions of the role of foreign consuls, the schematics of explosive air guns, and the ancient origin of coined money. But this was what this magazine did. By the middle of the 1880s, the British Locomotive and Engineers Brotherhood took notice of the successful strategy of what they called organization by magazine. That basically, but the magazine itself was spreading the locomotive firemen's message to lots and lots of people, even to engineers and even to others that had once been firemen and remained in the order just to get the magazine. Okay. In 1892, though, Debs, it's a good question. Was it good, solid information, or do your research information? It was arguably about as good as Wikipedia. There were, some of the stuff was Debs sort of riffing on things, but the science was actually not bad. I haven't read all of them. I've read a bunch of the magazines, but the science was not bad. The chemistry was well described. The physics was pretty good, but some of the other parts have not worn well. Like the history of pyramids and some of the ancient origins of money and stuff like that was probably right for the 1880s and 1890s, but we would basically dismiss it now. Okay, so Debs was involved in, and somebody raised this earlier about Jacob Hall did about the contention between the conductors and the engineers and others, and the piece that we read briefly talked about this as well. A series of internecine conflicts between the brotherhoods led to some spectacular failures. The worst conflict was the 1888 Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy strike, in which the Knights of Labor actively recruited strikebreakers against the engineers in retaliation for the engineers having broken a strike that was pushed by the Knights of Labor. The brotherhoods tried to create a supreme council in aftermath of that strike, but it collapsed in 1892 when other unions ignored a switchman strike in Buffalo. So these tensions between them broke down, and Debs wrote, organized labor appealed to organized labor for support in a just cause, and this is the 1892 strike, and the other unions just provided oceans of sympathetic drool. Okay, so he leaves the order in 1892 and he creates a new organization called the American Railway Union. But a little bit of background to that. In January of 1892, in part because of an organization called the General Managers Association, began operations, and it united under a single banner the 24 railroads that all converged in Chicago. The city was, of course, a natural meeting point of the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River, and so those 24 railroads were very powerful and important. Nature made it a railway shed, but the railroads made it a nerve center for the nation's coast-to-coast transportation. The GMA quickly established rules for, in the words of one investigator, switching, car service, loading and unloading cars, and weights of livestock. That's all to the good. But the GMA also established what it called the Chicago scale of pay for switchmen and other employees. The GMA directly communicated its demands to unions and established agencies to bring replacement workers from wherever they came in case of necessity. So the General Managers Association was an organization that was designed to establish standards, but also to break the unions, the locomotive firemen and the locomotive engineers. Debs and a council formed of the Grand Masters of the firemen, the conductors, and the carmen responded to the GMA by organizing to form their own consolidated agency called the American Railway Union in February of 1893. And this first meeting took place a few months before the 1893 Depression. It was a depression that had little to do with labor and a lot to do with sugar and something to do with gold, yet Debs' union would be at the center of the post-Depression conflict. The new organization would be open to all white men, including engine wipers and sign painters. It was an industrial union modeled on the parts of labor, but without and this is crucial or somewhat crucial, the Knights' willingness to accept black union locals. So it was a white-only union. It was an industrial union, but it was a white-only union. The Knights, so Debs was at this point a staunch Indiana Democrat committed to the ideology that drove the old party system. He shared with Indiana Democrats all the racial antipathy to black men that the democracy entailed, the Democratic Party entailed at that time. While Debs was proud of the Union Army for breaking slavery in the South, he saw no place for black men in his grand plan of union. Eventually, this would change. But this was initially the American Railway Union. It was going to be a white-only union for engineers and firemen and conductors and brakemen. In the spring of 1894, in the aftermath of the Depression, before the union's members had even met to write a constitution, the American Railway Union quickly won 2 victories by using binding arbitration. On the Union Pacific, which went under receivership in the Depression of 1893, the receiver basically forced the Union Pacific to meet with the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Engineers. On the Great Northern Railway, Railroad President James Hill confidently believed he could crush the new union with outside arbitration as he had a year earlier, but in May of 1894 he was forced to agree to arbitration with the ARU because of the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce. The St. Paul Chamber of Commerce basically forced Hill to negotiate with the unions. So the unions go from being relatively underpowered in the 1890s and a secret order to being, in the midst of this depression, a little bit more powerful than usual. In the Union Pacific, because of binding arbitration, because they went into receivership, in the Northern Pacific Railway, though, Great Northern Railway, it was because Pillsbury wanted to export flour and they didn't want any kind of strike and was willing to pay higher rates if that was going to happen. So the ARU, American Railway Union, gained members at the rate of 2,000 a day in 1894. So this is a kind of mushroom union. It's a union that has relatively few people in it to begin with, and then just explodes in terms of members. Members of the Firemen's Brotherhood complained that the Debs' new union was simply a correspondence union and really just based on the subscriptions. This ARU magazine that comes out is very much like the Locomotive Fireman's magazine. And locomotive engineers complained that this lax method of entry, that basically you sent in your membership, your requirement, you sent in a membership form and your $2 a year that you paid for death benefits, and it opened it up to lots and lots of people. In fact, the Railroad Brotherhoods complained that, quote, Mexicans, Dagoes, and Negroes could join the organization because there was no test to see if you were white or not. So this is the union's Kirka 1890s. Okay, so in 1893 then, the financial panic, George Pullman cut piece rates for 4,500 men and women who manufactured and repaired Pullman cars. In some cases, cutting piece rates by more than 50%. Now, Pullman does not run a railroad. All he does is produce the Pullman cars, which are the really fancy cars for the railroads. He, however, did not lower the rent for the company-owned housing that he had, and so he cut wages by 50%, but he did not cut the rents. And because Pullman ran a few miles of track in the city of Pullman, carpenters and painters tried to join the American Railway Union, but were initially rebuffed. After they were kicked out, they applied again to the American Railway Union, and very, very Debs voted against it. But the Common Council of the locomotive firemen and engineers and carpenters and brakemen basically felt sorry for the Pullman workers who were locked out and allowed them to join. Now, this is a terrible idea for a union, to allow people who have just been unemployed to join the union, but this is what they did, the American Railway Union. And it sought to galvanize support for the Pullman workers in neighboring Chicago, and they got financial and food pledges from the mayor, support from the Chicago Daily News, and many other trade unions. As Chicagoans marveled at Pullman's unwillingness to discuss the lockout, the ARU convened its first meeting in Chicago between June 9th and June 26th of 1894. Delegates, moved by the testimony of men and women overworked, underpaid, and expelled by Pullman, overruled Debs's warning and made them members. The members allowed the locked-out Pullman workers to join the ARU and then voted to boycott Pullman cars on all associated railroads on June 26th, 1894. And this would be the largest strike in single strike in the United States history. Sympathy strike spread faster than the ARU, as non-affiliated and even non-unionized workers refused to carry Pullman cars. The 5 major Eastern Railway trunk lines had competing hubs in Chicago. All 5 saw a drop in traffic. West of Chicago, members in Montana and California stopped nearly all traffic between Chicago and the West Coast. So this is a strike that also basically paralyzes the United States, or not paralyzes, but strongly reduces it. In some cases, they just pulled off the Pullman cars and put on mail cars and things like that. But in other cases, they just stop entirely if there were enough Pullman cars on them. So President Cleveland's Attorney General, Richard Olney, who is still acting as counsel, the chief lawyer for the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, ordered mail cars attached to Pullman cars. When he does so, it's basically a bald attempt to justify the use of federal troops to stop the Chicago strike. These federal troops were selected and appointed directly by the GMA, the General Managers Association. The mayor of Chicago and the governor of Illinois both opposed the arrival of federal troops. They came to Chicago on July 3rd, inflaming the city's population, and in the first days of July, pitched night battles broke out between supporters of the strike and federal troops on the hundreds of square acres of railroad property in Chicago. 4 buildings were consumed by fire in the Chicago Exposition. The federal troops blamed the strikers. The mayor said that the federal troops covertly started the fires themselves. We'll never know for sure what happened, but basically what starts as a strike becomes a riot in Chicago. By the 3rd of July, there were 30,000 federal, state, and local troops in Chicago. The members of the ARU were enjoined by a federal court to stop the strike and then jailed for contempt when they proved unable to stop it. It made Debs a martyr to workers around the country. An appalled Texas governor who had traveled to Chicago to visit the Columbian Exposition, saw the conflict firsthand, and he declared the strike peaceful and the president's calling of troops disorderly and a violation of states' rights. So interestingly, the Democrats, it's a Southern Democrat supports the strikers, and he says it's a violation of states' rights to use federal troops against strikers. Democrats in control of the House and Senate were mostly appalled by the actions of Olney, who is the Attorney General, but nonetheless supported the president's calling of troops. They sensed that public opinion in rural areas served by the railroads had turned strongly against the strikers once the train stopped moving. And newspapers as far away as Texas and Florida suggest that there was a lot of opposition to this 1894 strike. Pennsylvania's Republican congressman and songwriter Matthew Marriott Brosius predicted a Republican avalanche in November of 1894. That this strike, he said, would lead all of the people who had shifted to the Democratic Party to shift to the Republican Party. Now, let me show you again. 1892, after the McKinley tariff is passed, we see so much opposition to the Republicans, that the $1 billion Congress, that we see a sort of blue wave, a Democratic wave that emerges in the North, as lots and lots of people shift to the Democratic Party in opposition to the Republican Party, which they see as being sort of in cahoots with the biggest trusts. So there's opposition to the $1 billion Congress. Nonetheless, the $1 billion Congress is largely responsible for the 1893 depression. That said, it's 3 years later that this happens, and it's basically the depression is blamed on Democrats. The other thing is that people blame the strike on the Democrats because it's a Republican in power and all of the lines are paralyzed. Chicago and it's Olney, who's a Democratic attorney general, who cracks down on the strike. So there's a weird response to this strike in that the Democrats basically kind of get the blame for this strike at the same time as people who oppose the strike or support the strike hate the Democrats because the Attorney General is a Democrat and is involved in this, if that makes sense. He writes a song. Another day of crashing banks, of mills a-shutting down, from rock-ribbed old New England to Kansas prairies brown, for idle men in cities and idle men in farms, more reinforcements of idle men in empty-handed swarms. Courage on us, sons of labor, vainly hustling for a job, perchance with vacant stomach, weary brain, and empty fob. Though the actors are disgusting and the drama long and tame, yet the powers that be are moving and will get there just the same. In this dreary land of Grover Cleveland, the Democrat, neither milk nor honey flows. Party chose revel where the promised late clover grows, and 'tis hard lines for the toiler where no factory spindle hums. But there's hope a little later when the big storm comes. The big storm that he predicted was the Republican sweep of 1894. So much opposition to Grover Cleveland, so much opposition to the strike that we see. This is the. Bear with me. This is the shift in party representation, and you can see the net gain on the right. That this is the biggest change in. Largest shift in congressional power in American history in 1894. Partly as a response to the Panic of 1893, partly as a response to the Great Strike, the Pullman Strike of 1894. A sense that Democrats are effectively blamed for this strike. They're also blamed for the Depression, even though it's really the McKinley tariff that's got the most to do with the cause of this Depression. The general strike of 1894 caused Democrats to lose traction among Northern workers and among the AFL, who spent the next dozen years trying to reel them back in. Many Democrats many workers leave the Democratic Party. Some join the Republican Party, others join the Socialist Party. And so the Socialist Party is the biggest third party that we see, and it emerges in this period in part response to the ARU strike. So these regions then become strongly Republican from 1894 really until the New Deal. The populist movement grew more quickly in the South after 1894 than before. This threat led Southern Democrats like Pitchfork Ben Tillman to embrace more direct and violent opposition to black voting. So this is what happens. This is the 1894 election, which so from this period on, we're going to see basically Republican dominance all the way up until the 1930s. The significant thing here is that there are a lot of things that the populists, the third party movements, but the populists and the socialists push for in this period, that federal regulation of railroads, a flexible currency, a system of postal banks, an 8-hour day, a 40-hour week, and national pension plans that were ridiculed by both parties as the utopian visions of those who allowed themselves an attitude of labor in its abstract and imaginary sense, unquote. This weird fusion, this weird transformation of the political landscape leads to basically these third party movements, the Progressives, which are mostly a rural party, and the Socialists, which are largely an urban party, to leave the Republican and the Democratic parties. And the Republican Party is increasingly going to, after 1894, pull in many of those reforms that are initially associated with the Progressives and with the Socialists. In fact, the progressive movement is largely people in the Democratic side and the Republican side coming together over common reforms that each of their parties individually object to. The Democratic Party objects to these sort of common social welfare reforms because they would cost money and violate states' rights. The Republicans opposing them largely because they believe in fiscal conservatism. But this progressive movement is going to grow out of this weird kind of across the aisle movement on both sides. In fact, progressivism is increasingly going to become associated with reforming Republicans in the North and reforming Democrats in the South. So in the end, these third-party movements were adopted. The energy and the demands of the third-party movements were adopted piecemeal by both parties under the label of progressivism between 1894 and, say, 1919. Exactly. Well, they wanted more inflation. There was deflation, and so they wanted some inflation. They wanted basically a flexible currency. And that's basically what we have now is mild inflation, which is something that the populists wanted. In the end, the energies of both third-party movements were adopted piecemeal by both parties under the label progressivism. Eugene Debs, the American labor movement's most effective master of social networking, might have been pleased by the final reckoning, although he lost bitterly. The ARU was totally destroyed in the 1894 strike. The dying water bugs of the American Railway Union had crusted over to form the coral reef that became the American welfare state, just as Debs had unknowingly predicted in 1880. Thanks so much. Sorry to go over. See you guys on Wednesday. Yes, Cleveland was the president in 92. Yeah, and was blamed for the 93 Depression. Thanks, everybody.